that have resided here for many thousands of years, and by Métis communities that have developed in the last hundreds of years. We have two speakers this afternoon, Virginia Rodino and Parry Mudhar, and each speaker will have 20 minutes to speak. Then we'll have an opportunity for discussion, and the speakers will have a few minutes to wrap up at the end. I'd like to remind anyone who's been here all afternoon and newcomers of the Zoom protocol. So we would ask you to mute your Zoom except for if you're speaking, and to keep your video off if you're not speaking. So we will start with Virginia Rodino, who is a member of Marx 21 in the US. Virginia is currently the convener of United Against Hate and Fascism and president of the Maryland chapter of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, AFL-CIO, and the co-chair of the Maryland Green Party. Over to you, Virginia.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for being here. Good afternoon. As we convene today together across Turtle Island, I'm speaking from Baltimore, Maryland, which is the ancestral land of the Susquehannock, Nantego, and Piscataway nations. I offer my respect and gratitude to the indigenous peoples past and present, whose custodial responsibility we benefit from. And I solemnly acknowledge the land that has been stolen from these nations. And really to segue right into it for my talk, I will start with the racist beginnings of the police states here in the United States. The overview is how the police are a violent and racist tool of class oppression. And this tool cannot be reformed and must be abolished altogether. And we as socialists argue that the police are the first line of defense for the ruling class. In the United States, the first police force that employed full-time officers paid with public funding was created in the city of Boston in 1838. And unsurprisingly, at that time, Boston was a large shipping commercial center where business owners felt compelled to protect their property from non-property owners, such as Irish immigrants who lived in deprivation in that port city. During the same time, during the creation of that first police force in the South, police forces were created not for the protection of shipping interests, but for the preservation of the slave system. Slave patrols organized groups of armed white men, enforced discipline on slaves in the antebellum South. These forces were created to chase down runaway slaves and to quash slave revolts. The first formal slave patrol was created in North and South Carolina in 1704. After the abolition of slavery during Reconstruction, slave patrols were transformed into sheriff's departments, and they enforced segregation and disenfranchised freed slaves. A police studies expert describing this period said that New England settlers appointed Indian constables to police Native Americans. The St. Louis police were founded to protect residents from Native Americans, and many Southern police departments began as slave patrols. In 1704, the colony of Carolina developed the nation's first slave patrol. Slave patrols helped to maintain the economic order and assisted wealthy landowners in recovering and punishing slaves who were considered property. The similarities between the slave patrols and modern American policing are too salient to dismiss or ignore. Hence, the slave patrol should be considered a forerunner of modern American law enforcement. Police forces, early police forces were also used to control unions, strikes, and elections. When workers began forming unions to fight for improved working conditions and fair wages, the police served the interests of the factory owners. By the late 1880s, all major US cities had police forces born out of fears of the unionizing of large waves of Catholic, Irish, Italian, German, and Eastern European immigrants. At the same time, the police were also used as a tool to wield political power. A Time magazine article in 2017 explained that the late 19th century was the era of political machines. So police captains and sergeants for each precinct were often picked by the local political party ward leader, who often owned taverns or ran street gangs that intimidated voters. They then were able to use police to harass opponents of that particular political party or provide payoffs for officers to turn a blind eye to allow illegal drinking, gambling, and prostitution. Police departments in the States have a 400-year-old history of racism that is built upon the capitalist need to control large, defiant crowds in order to protect their wealth, property, and position in society. Those in defiance have often been people of color, have often been immigrants, and have always been members of the working class. And so why do we as socialists not advocate for reform? The police have become increasingly militarized and have been trained to escalate rather than de-escalate explosive situations. Because of the militarization of the police, how the police are trained, and who the individuals are who join the police, ordinary people need to start to make the decisions about what safety looks like for their communities. We must end this racist institution. We are seeing a revolutionary turn in the present moment to defund the police. The movement for Black Lives had transitioned from trying to make the police nicer, which was kind of the liberal policy, the reigning liberal policy, instead to taking control of the capitalist tool of disciplining us, which is the police force. In the book, The End of Policing, it was observed that, quote, by conceptualizing the problem of policing as one of inadequate training and professionalization, reformers failed to directly address how the very nature of policing and the legal system serve to maintain and exacerbate racial inequality. At roots, they failed to appreciate that the basic nature of the law and the police, since its earliest origins, is to be a tool for managing inequality and maintaining the status quo. Police reforms that fail to directly address this reality are doomed to reproduce it. The campaign to defund the police, led by the movement for the Black Lives, represents nothing less than a chance to redefine the social contract, because we can't limit ourselves to discussion of the police if we're talking about addressing systemic oppression and historical racism. We have to talk about inequalities across society and connect the dots when we're talking about defunding the police. And it's that defunding that's the revolutionary turn we need, and that we need to push as socialists. Divesting from the police and investing instead in other social programs that communities want and need is the serious revolutionary step forward. And it shows that ordinary people can control the budgets for their states and municipalities and take over the state apparatuses that we as revolutionaries must advocate. Students on college campuses, parents and teachers in schools, and working families and communities across the country are eliminating one of the most powerful and reactionary institutions on the planet, the militarized US police force. They are proving to themselves and others that it is possible to take complete control over significant parts of society, and that the existence of police is not an innate, unchangeable factor. By empowering ordinary people with the ability to dismantle this racist and corrupt institution, the cracks are forced even wider to reveal how unnatural the entire system of capitalism is. And we are seeing through the defund movement how we can control the wealth that we produce. In March 2021, The Guardian reported that more than 20 major cities have reduced their police budgets in some form, which is an unprecedented trend. In 2020 budget votes, advocacy groups won more than $840 million in direct cuts from US police departments and at least $160 million in investments, instead turning that into $160 million in investments in community services. And in 25 cities, such as Denver and Oakland, officials moved to remove police from schools, which saved taxpayers an additional $34 million. Portland, Oregon cut $15 million from its budget and disbanded a gun violence reduction unit and transit team that had both long been accused of over-policing Black communities. San Francisco officials pledged to divest $120 million from police over 2 years, with plans to invest instead in health programs and workforce training. Minneapolis is using police cuts to launch a mental health team to respond to certain 911 calls. Austin, Texas has made some of the most dramatic changes in the country, directly cutting roughly $20 million from the police department and moving $80 million from the agency by shifting certain services out of law enforcement. The city has gone from spending 40% of its $1.1 billion general fund on police to now allocating about 26% to law enforcement. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and a dozen other cities have also reduced police spending. There are hurdles to this movement to shift money to budget priorities in our communities that actually reimagine what community safety actually could be. One of the greatest obstacles to defunding law enforcement agencies are powerful police unions, which have long opposed reforms and negotiated strong protections in their contracts that typically make it impossible for cities to terminate or lay off officers. Unions have launched aggressive PR campaigns to counter the movement. In Austin, the Texas Municipal Police Association created highway billboards saying, "Warning, Austin police defunded, enter at your own risk," and limited support next 20 miles. They put up signs in September before the new budget had gone into effect. The Republican governor of Texas has also repeatedly threatened to try to force Austin to restore its police budget through legislation, and other state Republicans have spread misinformation about crime rates in the city. In July of 2020, as Black Lives Matter protests against police violence were sweeping the country in the States, the AFL-CIO, a coalition of unions representing nearly 15 million people, formed a racial justice task force to formulate the plan for taking concrete action to address America's long history of racism and police violence against Black people. In early May, a left media outlet obtained and published excerpts of an unreleased draft version of the report. And this report the final report has actually been published and has not changed much at all. The substance of the report's recommendations call for the creation of a new training and enforcement program administered by police unions to weed out bad officers, effectively aiming to make police unions themselves the primary mechanism for reforming police practices. It amounts to a definitive embrace of the importance of police unions to the labor movement and a rejection of calls from progressive union members for the AFL-CIO to separate itself from police unions. The report, unfortunately, also rejects the idea of defunding the police and calls instead for additional funding. Unsurprising, because the subcommittee itself is made up solely of unions that represent police members. Despite this pushback and this backsliding, we have made great strides in the past year in the United States to dismantle the racist police institution. Police forces are just simply not a natural part of human nature or human society. They were created to protect capitalism and capitalists' interests. Because the struggle to abolish them is inseparable from the struggle to build a better socialist world, our fight is huge but necessary. And all the victories won by, in particular, the youth leading the movement for Black lives, we are showing it is possible. And absolutely necessary, but certainly very, very possible. And this is the struggle that we must help support, participate in, be involved in, and lift up in order to dismantle this racist institution. We can create a better world without the racist trappings of the old. If we truly believe that Black Lives Matter, we must defund the police. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Virginia. Next up, we have Parry Mudhar, who is a member of the Vancouver branch of the International Socialists. So over to you, Parry.
Thank you so much, Virginia, about that, for your great segment of the talk. I'm going to be speaking about some of the theoretical approaches on the police and what us as socialists can look forward to in a world of democratic living without the police. So as the loud call for defund the police has recently gained enormous traction in the streets and permeated into political discord, as militarized police receive funding over actual essential services like those in healthcare, firefighters, paramedics, etc., and continue to abuse their power when actual help is needed and face little or no consequences for their enormous negligence when tried for their crimes. Many socialists and those on the left have clear demands as to how this architecture of this branch of government should be restructured. And that is merely a single layer in the labyrinth, which is our current social economic system. In the current capitalist state, the safest communities are not the ones with the most police. With the Gestapo routinely searching houses, youth getting frisked on the street for small amounts of marijuana so the state can set them up for a lifetime of failure, or the constant song of police sirens during a night. No, the safest communities are the ones who get the most funding for school and after school programs, extracurriculars, libraries, parks, community resources, etc. In no way does an armed brigade of riffraffs who can't tell a taser from a gun ensure your safety. The police serve the capitalist class, the bosses, the 1% who lobby the government for supreme control of the state. Quoting Lenin, the police are merely special bodies of armed men at the state's and your boss's disposal. The police serve Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, and our very own dear NDP alike. Who was dispatched when slaves revolted and ran away from their master's plantation? Who was dispatched when civil rights leaders and communities were peacefully protesting the integration of high school, the integration of college? Who was called to ensure Malcolm X's security detail was compromised on his last day of his last speech? Where I'm situated right now in Canada, over 100% of this land in BC is unceded Indigenous territory. Absolutely none of it belongs to the state. Who was called by our dear leader, John Horgan of the Workers' Party, the NDP, to invade sovereign Wet'suwet'en land, destroy barricades, arrest their people, and brutalize their elders to throw a pipeline in the middle of their ancestral land that they've stewarded since time immemorial. When militant strikes occurred in sweatshop type workplaces with little or no actual regulations, who is on site by the boss's wishes? All the food you eat at the grocery store, whether it's the cleanest free-range chicken, vegetables, or fruits harvested by temporary foreign workers with almost no rights and are completely tied to their companies like plantations. If they had a wildcat strike tomorrow, could you even imagine the police presence and actions as they work away from the eyes of the general population? The police, the RCMP, SWAT were created to ensure that the population observes the heavy-handed demands of the ruling class without objection or face dire consequences for their community or death. If this is the role of the police within capitalism, then is a class on sensitivity training going to ensure they don't brutalize elders as standing rock with mace and tasers as they stand in the way of bulldozers? Is racial training going to end the fact that marginalized communities are often the ones who have the most drug convictions so that prisons continue to make profit off of their free labor? None of these gestures will make even the slightest change in stopping police murders and brutalization, as the problem doesn't start or end with the police. It starts and ends with our current economic system. To abolish the police, we must abolish capitalism. In our current system, monetary gain is created by exploiting the surplus labor of the working class and also the so-called middle class that actually has no real meaning to it, and everyone else that works by their own labor or services to survive. That monetary gain is not used for the benefit of society. It's used merely to create more monetary gain for the bosses, who are able to keep tight control of the system by force of the police to ensure that the machines, computers, and resources that workers use are forever in their control and not in the public's control. By this means, all value coming from these resources are funneled through them first. The plantations were patrolled by overseers. Vast resources, land resources, and mineral resources, and also animal resources such as furs in Canada were controlled by the RCMP. The police and state enforced the sharecropper system that kept so many in abject poverty. As soon as any workers try to unionize Amazon and take over the very means that Bezos is allowed to amass billions, while workers rely on food stamps, which are funded by workers themselves through taxes, the police will be right there to arrest occupiers for theft of property, unruly behavior, or merely keep them all locked up in the prison complex for days, months, or years as they await a trial date and can't afford bail in the guilty until proven innocent system that the working class and the working class alone is subject to within our system. So to look at where we've come with not abolishing the police, but merely getting part ways there. If you look at Minneapolis City Council, which settled on cutting police funding by 1.5 million. This is less than 1% of the total budget of the 190 million budget they set aside. Democratic Mayor Jacob Frey endorsed this essentially meaningless move that was allowed. In Washington, D.C., the proposed police budget for 2021 is 578 million. To appease protesters, the city council proposed cutting only 15 million or 2.5% at all levels of government. The US spends roughly double on police, prisons, and courts what it spends on food stamps, welfare, and income supplements. Nationwide, police budgets total a whopping 114.5 billion in 2017. Here in Canada, Calgary and Edmonton spend 750 million a year on the police. With just counting what Edmonton spends on new police cars each year, it comes to around 70% of the city's budget for housing and homelessness. It isn't wages, training, or building maintenance. It's literally new cars. In 2019 in Toronto, the police received all social programs and services were slashed. With all the money that the VPD receives, the Vancouver Public Police Department, why is there still an opioid crisis in the downtown east side? And why has the area not received any real funding for housing and addiction relief? The police aren't even a bandaged solution. They're an infection to the disease of capitalism. So what happens when we have no police? If our jobs and society were democratic in nature, we could decide on where to put this immense worth of money and funding. We could choose to invest in better schooling and after-school programs and extracurricular activities in an area where youth are falling behind and little work opportunities exist. We could invest heavily in crisis counseling and housing in areas where drug abuse is high. But this takes into account if we still were operating in a capitalist system where the only real democratic aspect of our lives is voting based on where you live every certain amount of years. We still have no democracy in our workplace. We still have no democracy in our community. We still have no democracy in 99.9% of our daily lives. So these issues of drug abuse, poor housing, starvation, wages for inadequate job opportunities are themselves branches of the failing capitalist system. If we actually had true democracy in our daily working lives, would these issues even be existence? And if they still exist to one degree or another, then much better solutions exist to eliminate the root cause of this problem. And the continuing roundabout, where growing up in the wrong area code ensures you have an easier pipeline to the prison system. So when we as socialists say disband the police, we have to always consider that the underlying issue here is disbanding capitalism. Without disbanding capitalism, we will never get rid of the police because capital, the bosses, the 1% who lobby the government will always need a means to protect the machines, the services that they use to funnel your surplus wages for their own account of money. This is how Bezos, this is how all these billionaires have amassed this amount of money. So once again, when we say disband the police, we mean disband capitalism as well. So that takes us to around 1 o'clock. I had a few other things to say, but I am going to leave it when we come back for our final comments.
Thank you, Parry. So we'll open the floor up for discussion. I will take names for speakers. We have about actually we have about half an hour for discussion. So if you would like to speak, please put up your hand or type your question, type something in chat, and please keep your comments to 3 minutes at the most, and then we'll circle back to Virginia and Parry to follow up at the end. Okay, I have Dave.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Good to hear Parry talk. I've heard him at some of the Vancouver IS meetings in the past, those that I can get to. You know, and it's very easy for us Canadians to adopt an attitude of smugness around police and the need to defund police, you know, and easy to cast our eyes southward and think, good thing we're not like those Americans and their police departments. However, I think events recently have been brought to a head in this country and certainly on the West Coast. And for me, because I have an interest in environmentalism, that when the need to protect the planet butts up against the needs of capitalism and the needs of corporate interest, you know, then we really get to witness how our police are also militarized, you know, and I look at what's happened on Vancouver Island, for example, in the Ferry Creek watershed around old growth logging. And, you know, I'm looking at our police, you know, who our government and our history tells us should have a good name, you know, the RCMP, you know, noble defenders of freedom and democracy and such, you know the line. Yet, you know, in many ways of looking at the actions of the police on the west coast of Canada right now, they're not police, they're an occupying army. And I think arguably there's good reason to suggest from some people's perspectives that they're invading other nations. If one holds to the view that First Nations are nations in their own right. And when our government, our federal government, liberal government, speaks to First Nations, they're speaking nation to nation. So when the RCMP, the federal police force, occupies, walks on, and violently arrests peaceful protesters, they're an invading army. They have stopped being a police force. As bad as they are as a police force, there's not a week goes by when we don't hear something on the news. And this is the mainstream media. It's controlled by capitalist interests, and even they report police brutality. So one has to wonder just how systemic is the brutality in our own police system. And you see them, if I walked around the streets, not carrying weapons, but just dressed as they were, I would be arrested for being a terrorist. We need to think long and hard about our police force in this country. Thanks. Over.
Thank you, Dave. Do we have any other questions or comments? Bradley?
Yeah, I'm also here on the west coast of what's currently called Canada in British Columbia, on the lands of the Quechua First Nation, unceded and traditional lands. And just following on from what Dave was saying, I think the RCMP were initially created to be part of enforcing the Canadian occupation of the center of the continent, the prairies, right? And driving the nations that were there off their land and preventing them from continuing their traditional livelihoods and controlling their own lives. And of course, it's been much in the news lately about the genocide implemented by way of the residential schools, where Indigenous children were imprisoned for well over 100 years. And it was the RCMP that were sent into communities to round up the children or to chase them down when they escaped from these school prisons. And yet, I think the only other country I know of that does this, I think, is maybe Britain. In Canada, the RCMP are a tourist attraction, right? If you go to the junky touristy shops down in Vancouver, you find little RCMP dolls. So there's a little statue of one of the tourist shops has a little statue of like an anime RCMP sort of statue in front of the thing, and which I think in some ways I think the United States is way ahead of Canada in sort of understanding the nature of the state, in that I've always thought there are left Americans like Malcolm X and Howard Zinn and all kinds of people like that, the Black Panthers and stuff, who in some way can be seen or understood to be anti-American. And if you look at the history of the Canadian left, outside of Indigenous organizing, there really isn't anybody you can point to and say is anti-Canadian. I think that's a huge weakness of the Canadian left. And I think it's entwined with this idea that our police are somehow different than other people's police. Ours are cuddly, tourist attractions. And so I think it's just trying to break this down, right? And trying to understand that the police are part of this system, that the courts are part of this system, that the schools are part of the system, that the universities are part of the system. This is a system that isn't about making people's lives better. It's about keeping us down and building up the science of racism and building up the history that kind of justifies the Canadian occupation of this part of the continent and all that kind of thing. And all of that has to be swept away, right? And when we talk about abolishing the police, we're talking about that as part of a program of destroying Canada, right? And I think it's really exciting this year that there's a bit of a move for Cancel Canada Day. It seems much bigger. There's always been small kind of far left anti-Canada Day rallies, but they haven't had much traction. And some cities are now saying they're going to at least temporarily cancel their Canada Day celebrations and things like this. And I think this is something as socialists we should leap on, right? And bring this in and say, look, it's not just the symbolism of Canada. There's a state, there's the courts that imprison Indigenous people way more than they're represented in the population, right? There's the police that arrest Indigenous people way more than the rest of the population, and on and on and on. And that this is what it means to be Canadian. This is what Canada is about. And I think we want to be a little bit gentle with people, because some people can find that a hard truth to face up to. But I think we really need to push on this, because now is a chance to create like an anti-Canadian left in a way that we haven't seen, in a way that America has seemed to have had historically for a very long time. And it has never really broken through here in Canada, this idea that you could be on the left and against Canada just hasn't been something that we've been able to build in this country.
Thank you, Bradley. Any other questions, comments, discussion? Okay, if we don't have any more discussion, then I will send it back to our speakers, Virginia and Parry, to round. Oh, looks like we have another speaker, Ryan. Go ahead, Ryan.
Thank you. Hello. Yeah, sorry about that. I was trying to mute my TV before I jumped in to speak, so it just took me a second there. I want to thank both of the speakers for this talk. I think it's really fascinating, especially in Canada, especially because this conversation, it seems to be heavily influenced by what we're seeing in the States, but I think a lot of people are having this really, really complicated conversation about defunding the police and what that looks like. And I think it's really important to have as well, because when you look at something like the RCMP and the VPD in Vancouver, they've got these massive militarized budgets and very, very, very minimal training. So an RCMP officer gets about 6 months of training in Regina and then spends a year at a detachment and then, or sorry, spends a year in the field and then finds a detachment. So that's, when you think about some of these issues about Indigenous sovereignty, they're so complex and they're so unique to the specific community. To have the proper training to actually be able to integrate with the community and actually do not policing, but the work that we think we want a police officer to do, I think it takes an incredible amount of years and years working with that community, not just being sent there as part of your detachment. I think it takes an incredible amount of training. These issues about these political and sociological issues, I think you could spend years studying before you can come up with any real answers and do a lot of activism and a lot of work in community. So I'm really concerned when a police officer gets about 6 months training and then he's sent out there and he's got, you know, his car full of guns and everything like that. So I'm really curious as well about this conversation, because I get this feeling that as we push for the defunding, if this conversation isn't strong enough on the left, it's very easy for, say, maybe the police get defunded, they get less training, they get less of the things that they're already very precarious and that they need, and then there's more failures of the police, and then the police go, this is what happens when you defund us. We actually need more training, we need sensitivity training, and then they push for that. There's that kind of rebound. So I'm really curious around that conversation, and I think the left need to have a really, really strong voice. I think a lot more organizing needs to be done in Vancouver around it. I think this is the first time in a long time this conversation is kind of mainstream, because we at Vancouver City Council the City Council tried to pass a motion to not just I mean, people wanted to defund, but they basically said, listen, VPD, you're not going to get a pay increase next year of like so many millions of dollars. And the VPD turned around and said, no, yes, we are. Sorry. We're actually going to get, we'll increase our budget, but not as much as, you know, maybe we originally, but we're still going to increase despite what City Council says. So there's no democratic check on it, which is really concerning as well. So it's like they get all this money and they get to do whatever they want with it and they get to dictate what they do with it. So I think the voice about defunding needs to be so strong, because you're fighting against this force that has no democratic check, especially in Vancouver. And a lot of people don't know that, and the police union is really strong. So I'd be curious what the speakers have to say, just maybe their own opinions around that conversation about defunding. That what does that left voice need to do? How do we organize around that? Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Anyone else? John?
Thank you. I'm wondering if the speakers could talk about their experience with the police and the police's support or of the far right, the fascists at different rallies that that you might have attended, where there's been a counter protest against the anti-fascist, by the anti-fascists against the Nazis or whoever, whatever right-wing racist groups. And certainly my experience in Toronto has been overall that the police are much more friendly to the far right groups, the Nazis, than they are to the counter protesters. And I'm just wondering if you've had similar experiences, or if there is a in your parts of where you are in the States and in British Columbia, if there's a discussion amongst lefties, about this dynamic and how prevalent it is.
Thanks, John. Tina?
Hi. Thank you so much to the speakers and all of the comments. I'm pretty new to Marx 21. I know some comrades who are involved, so I'm in the States. And I just wanted to, first of all, I wanted to sort of talk about last year's rebellion in the police with the movement for Black Lives being involved in the South, or what's like the southern part of the United States in North Carolina. And I just wanted to talk about like how, sort of piggybacking off what the last speaker or the last person just asked, when people sort of say, well, certain cities have friendlier police forces, and how to sort of combat that, or how to answer or respond. Because I know in the town I was living in, there were sort of comments like that. And then also I wanted to just talk about like, sort of the end of policing is really good, and also what people are reading now. And we do this till we free us, Mariam Kaba's book. In her book, people talk about, ending policing, but also connecting it with the carceral system, like the whole, and I think I was just wondering about like how to draw those connections, especially in what's the United States. How can we kind of connect ending policing and ending the whole prisons as they are, because a lot of the question is that gets asked sometimes, well, what do we do with rapists? And what Mariam Kaba responds is like, that's not the central question, right, of abolition. And so I guess I was just wondering what folks' thoughts on that were. So thanks.
Thanks, Tina. So maybe we can go back to Virginia and Parry, and maybe they'd like to comment on the discussion so far. So shall we start with Virginia?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I mean, they've been really, really good, insightful questions. I'll try to remember and start with Tina. I mean, yeah, I think, first of all, welcome to Marx 21. So we'll be happy to continue this discussion after this meeting, including like, what kind of readings we can do together and discussions after the fact. In terms of like individual police forces that could be friendlier, I think it's the same thing as, what we went through during the anti-war movement, like with individual soldiers, my son, my father, my daughter, and there are good individuals. But I think our responsibility and what we have to look at is the system, what is, and I think it's similar to dirty industries, for example. I mean, how do we get working class folks into industries or jobs that don't cause harm. So I think it's pretty much the same kind of arguments that we would have to win, that there might be good nice individual soldiers, but the whole system of war and military is anti-working class, and it's anti-global justice and peace. And I think that's the same argument with the police forces. Both Parry and I think kind of reviewed in terms of the systemic racism and the systemic racist underpinnings of how the police formed. Bradley touched upon this as well. So I think it's pulling back the argument to the systemic problems of the institution of the police force. In terms of, let's see, John brings up a really good point that I totally missed on my talk. Absolutely, a number of just traditional media outlets, mainstream media outlets have covered not just like sort of the wearing kid gloves when dealing with the far right by the police forces. I mean, the whole problem of how the Capitol Police and our intelligence agencies knew what was happening with January 6th and still actually stood down. And how many of people on the left said right after that, if that had been, Black Lives Matter activists, particularly if they were Black, what the response would have been. I mean, it would have been shut down before it started, first of all, but then of course the repression of the protesters would have been, much different, much bloodier, and so on. So, but I definitely see that they've discovered, that there were police, inactive, off-duty police officers participating in those demonstrations, and then we see how they're being handled in court, and how people are just out on bail, and they're not being held, and so on, and just have the difference in how the system is treating them too as they go to trial. So there is that. I mean, what Bradley said in terms of, let me try to remember what Bradley said, like being anti-Canadian. I mean, something that we can learn in terms of the lessons of I guess there's a silver lining to being, global imperialists and on top of the heap, because then the resistance, has to be just as sharp, so that we make, in the States, we've had to develop anti-imperialist critiques and put the US, on top of that list of who we critique and where our tax dollars are going for in a foreign policy and so on. So I think, that's the silver lining in terms of, like, for decades that we've had to have that critique from inside the States. But one thing I would say, and I don't know if this would apply, but we've had to be careful about being anti-American, and like I look at the immigrant justice movement, and when in the 90s, when there were, I think it was the early 2000s, when there were huge immigrant rights demonstrations, you saw these working class folks waving American flags and saying, "We are American." And so I think that the fact that we're not anti-Canadian people, we're not anti-American people, but we're against US imperialism, it could just be, like a slight tweaking, and that could be something, to just keep in mind as you develop the critique about Canadian imperialism and the Canadian state, as opposed to the Canadian people. And I think Ryan also asked some very good questions, which I will give Parry time to come back, because I think I've taken up a lot of time, but I'll maybe write in the chat some thoughts I had about Ryan's comments.
Thanks, Virginia. It looks like we will have time for more discussion after Parry responds, and we do have at least one other speaker, and so I will give you the opportunity to wrap up as well. So now I'll hand it over to Parry to respond to the discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think that was a really good discussion, and I think we have, like you said, Alex, some time for a little bit more after this. So Dave, your comment on the RCMP invading Indigenous sovereign land as an invading army, I think the Wet'suwet'en expressed this so vividly, that they are on unceded land and the RCMP are invading their territory, and every single picture that you saw, like when they had the gate barricaded saying reconciliation is dead, and they had to break through that. It's just so vivid about how the RCMP is on sovereign indigenous land that was never unceded, right? So absolutely right. And I think people are starting to see this day in and day out. And it really started with indigenous activism. Bradley, your comment on the RCMP and police, 100% just as violent as in every other occupying country. This is 100% right. Like when you in Canada Day coming up, when you fly a Canada flag, is this not the same Canada that McDonald wanted to force the Indian out of the Indian? Is this not the same Canada that the RCMP was forcing the Métis to starve as Louis Riel was hung? This is the exact same Canada. And as you celebrate Canada, are you not doing what the RCMP celebrated in these events as well? I think it's 100%. Like, it's just hypocrisy that we sell little figurines of the RCMP in stores in Gastown. These are the same RCMP who instigated these accounts. So Ryan, your comment on just no democratic voice in funding of the police or defunding the police. And I think that really brings up what I had said earlier. In our current economic system of capitalism, you have no democratic voice. You have a democratic voice every couple of years to say, hey, are we going to fund the military by this much or this much? You have no democratic voice in your job. You have no democratic voice in your community, and you have very, very little democratic voice if you're in a union, because most unions are not as militaristic as they once were. So until we are able to fully dismantle the system, you're not going to see the change that simple defunding is going to give you. You will see some change, but you're not going to see the change that is going to end the systematic racism that exists with policing. And then I think me and Bradley were talking about this, and Irfan, I think you were there too, about how in BC, or in Vancouver, or in BC, the police aren't the police budgets aren't funded by the municipalities. The funding is set by the province itself, which is not the case with any other public service. So how can it be that only the police have that much power in their funding? There's no democracy in that, and it will never be democracy in this if we don't get rid of the system that we're in today. So John, you're saying that in Toronto, the police are always much more friendly to the far right. And I think that this is, it's very true here too. And you can see this very vividly in the right's approach to their thin blue line. If you look at the Capitol riots that occurred, what really, like you had, like Virginia mentioned, you had some off-duty officers infiltrating the building as well. Now, if this had been Black Lives Matter, like you said, Virginia, this would have never been allowed to happen, right? Because as you know, you put a message on Facebook, who's reading, or you put a message on WhatsApp, Zuckerberg intervenes, where does it go? It goes straight to the cops, right? When the police were intervening to try to get Trump back into office. So if Trump is in office or Biden is in office, Lockheed Martin still gets their funding to bomb kids in Israel or in Palestine, in Syria, in Yemen, everywhere in the Middle East. If Black Lives Matter had their way, if any social movement had their way, and we're able to defund and end the system as it is, it would be a totally different issue. But the far right will always be in the pockets of the police because they want the system to continue as it is. So I'll leave it as that. Alex, do you want to take it away?
Thank you, Parry. Noelle had her hand up. Their hand up.
Yeah, Noelle, she or they, in the ever so infamous Portland, Oregon. Yeah, and just wanted to touch on a couple things. To start, Perry mentioned in the kickoff, like in passing, like this mythical middle class, most of whom are, actually workers and thus, still potential targets of the cops. That said, though, the cops are actually part of the actual middle classes, not just like one middle class, but they are in like their class position is between that of the workers and the owners of capital. In some ways, like if you picture like the most out of touch, asshole-ish middle manager, who's still paid a salary, but doesn't generally actually own the means of production. I mean, they're still the owners' enforcers. Now, picture if their power extended beyond the workplace and keeping you in line there to keeping you in line throughout, everywhere in society. And in addition to the threat of removing your livelihood, their arsenal also included physically assaulting you, imprisoning you, or even shooting and killing you, and on or off the job there. And you start to get to some of the role of cops in class society. They're used as strike breakers. They definitely don't belong in the labor movement. They're not working class. If they came from working class backgrounds, they're class traitors. And someone also brought up the question of their coziness with the fascists. Part of that, I think also has to do with like some of the class nature of fascism. It's largely a middle class movement of like, ruined, small business owners, the classic petty bourgeois, and like those layers of society and such, when crisis hits, working class can't chart a way forward, like, and if the state can't rely on, its own direct violence, to put the workers down, the workers movement down, then, whether it's just because, their police forces are ineffective or like they know they can't get away with it without, raising even more outrage, like they will lean on the fascist mob. That's also, one reason I think, why, just saying defund the police isn't enough. Like we need to actually disband the police. Like, and, in the process of this demand, we also need to be ready to, organize mass mobilizations and mass anti-fascist movements. But like, we need, capitalism needs, its special bodies of armed men, whether it's using, formal police force or, funding vigilantes and such. And so ultimately to get rid of, violence, by and on the orders of the capitalist class, we need to get rid of capitalism. And I think there was something I was going to put in there about like Pinkertons and whatnot and such, that didn't quite get as smoothly put in there. But I shall pass it back to the chair and the presenters, because I also have to be heading out. Thanks for the wonderful talk and conversational solidarity.
Thank you, Noah. So do we have any final comments before we go back to the speakers? James?
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of interesting things that come out of this, right? And when we talk about defunding the police, I think, you know, and obviously as Marxists and socialists, we understand that the end goal is the end of policing as we know it today, right? You know, because we can see, we have it on tape, right? We have the violence and the brutality that the police bring to not only Black and brown people in the streets of the United States, and the mass incarceration that's beget from that, but when workers have movements, and they go on strike, and the people that meet them at those front lines are police, right? And I think people are starting to become aware of the role that the police play in society, but there's still a big question about, well, how do we get there, right? And I think there's some fear about, the abolitionists sort of, or anarchists sort of just end it all at once. And I don't think that that's the goal right now. I mean, and I think that's why we have to say we do push for defunding, even though it's not the answer, right? I think defunding is the message that we need to stand behind, because it does strike such a chord right now, right? And people are, will come out against that, saying, you can't get rid of the police because, society would just, fall into complete disarray. But people are starting to realize that the police aren't controlled by us, and their function is above society, right? It's the control of workers, the control of society from, a ruling class perspective. And the road to that has to go through defunding, because I think people need to realize that that's not the answer. When we defund, we don't make the decisions on where those funds are going to go. We're not making decisions on how they restructure those funds, right? And so what does defunding beget us? And I don't think it's going to be a nicer, less racist police force. Right. I think they're still going to fill that function. We're still going to have racist police, and we're still going to have a mass incarceration system that's going to proliferate to other places, right? I mean, it's not just the United States that's going to end up with these huge prison populations. We've exported that, right? And it's not, right? And I think in Canada too. I don't live there, and I don't know the perspective, but I would say that that state is going to grow too. And I think there is a racist thread that exists there as well. So I think it's important that we push for that, because it's going to push people into the realization, I believe, that defunding is not the answer, and that we have to build up our own structures, right, that are able to compete or to replace. I mean, I think some of that exists with the example of Soviets and the commune, that there were structures that existed that were built from working class people to rival in some ways the structures that already existed, and we have to work towards that, and that means joining organizations, joining our unions, and pushing for the defunding that we desperately need. Not only that, but even further when that doesn't work, and we keep pushing. I think that's the goal. So I think these talks have been great. So I think that's all I had to say.
Thanks, James. Okay, so now I'll give it back to Virginia and Parry to wrap up. So Virginia.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for your additional contributions. I guess to just give an update, and it touches a little bit upon what Ryan was asking about in terms of potential drawbacks to the defund movement, that maybe we defund the police so much, that they're left even more inept and more kind of dangerous than they are now. I mean, in the States, what we're actually seeing is legislators are actually looking and at an increase in crime, and then using that to backtrack and refund the police. I mean, we are seeing that much more so than the danger of like emasculating or just rendering the police so ineffectual because they've got no funds at all. That's far from the case, at least in the States at this point. So really, the challenge for us is to maintain the gains, the hard fought, really decades long, because in the States, if we look, as we all know, as activists and socialists, these movements and campaigns often have been around for decades and decades, and it's just a spark that happens, and then it allows that space for the endless hours of work that people have laid over the years to come to fruition. So there were many grassroots community groups trying to get police out of schools, off campuses, and out of their communities, and that's what happened. And so we did have a wave of successes, but right now we're in the midst of kind of maintaining those successes. So asking the question, Ryan, about what are some things, I mean, take the US as a way to maybe some lessons, because right now we're trying to just maintain and hold what we have. And then, connected to that, putting faith into, electoralism, and trying to vote for politicians who may or may not can keep with their campaign goals and so on of defunding the police. I mean, really, it's continuing the pressure in the streets among the working class to put the pressure on. And I think that, I mean, James touched upon this a little bit, but I do think that some of the demands and some of the victories won, we have asked for how do we reallocate those funds. And I think recently in Chicago, the grassroots coalition that included labor, they started with, this is what we would like to see happen, and where will we get these funds? And so it's kind of like reversing the starting point and saying, we know we need this, we know we need more mental health advocates, we know we need stronger support in the schools, et cetera, but where are we going to get that? And then they're taking it from the police budget. So that's another kind of point. But where we're at in the States is actually trying hard to maintain what we know needs to happen, and that's defund. And kind of what James just said, it's really to abolish, and Noel said this, to abolish the police force, and to recreate what we know is what we need instead. And Angela Davis and others have said this and have written about this for many years, about reimagining what public safety really is, what really will keep our community safe, including infrastructure and better education and not being homeless and better healthcare. And I think it's also helping to steer the narrative about what safety actually means, because one speaker here did bring up the fact about, do police actually, I think Parry did, keep us safe? No, the cities, the towns that have high numbers of police actually are not the safest communities. So I'll leave it at that, but I think our work really has just begun. I mean, the movement for Black Lives has broken wide open the possibilities and the opportunities to reimagine a revolutionary moment where we take control of the budget, where we take control of real structures in society that have long been used to oppress us, and to instead turn it on its head and create parts of society, at least, that actually work for us. And so our work is cut out for us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Virginia. And over to you, Parry, for the last word.
Thank you all for attending this talk, and thank you, Virginia, for your excellent contributions in your half. I just wanted to touch on two things. So Virginia, you just mentioned Angela Davis and her contributions and talks about public safety. I also like to bring it back a bit with a quote from Malcolm X, where he talks about how the police and crime are inseparable. So where he says here, my boss's wife, when she had the time and the inclination to talk, would tell me many interesting things. She would talk to me about the Dutch Schultz days, about details that she had known, about graft paid to officials, rookie cops, and shyster lawyers right on top into the top levels of police and politics. She knew from personal experience how crime existed only to the degree that the law cooperated with it. She showed me how, in the country's entire social, political, and economic structure, the criminal, the law, and the politicians were actually inseparable partners. And that's all in the capitalist system that we live in to this very day. And it was the same in Malcolm X's time, and it's the same throughout our history. The last thing I want to say that for us in so-called Canada, as we approach Canada Day, I think one of the most important things is just to look at our own country or our own political system very, very critically. It's so easy, as Dave was mentioning earlier, that we have a smug look on our face and look at our neighbors down south saying, look at all these problems portrayed and the problems portrayed by the media. We have just the same problems here, except we have oddly a fuzzy blanket over them, which the rest of the world can't see. I think everybody remembers in Toronto, Regis Torczynski-Paquette, who fell or was pushed from her high-rise balcony when police were called by her mother, concerned about her emotional state. This is a wellness check. How did she die? I think you had a number of police in her apartment at the time for one woman who was called for emotional distress. How did she fall when you had that many bodies in the apartment at that time? I remember in New Brunswick how 26-year-old Chantel Moore was shot and killed by police. Police had been called to check on her safety because she was being stalked and harassed. She answered the door holding a knife because of this, and she was shot 5 times. We have the same problems. We have big problems, and they're not being addressed and in the same way. And I think as Canada Day approaches, we need, or any day approaches, but we need to keep a critical eye on ourselves and what we are doing in our own communities to keep them safe, because the police by themselves are not going to keep them safe. And as I've said before, with more funding, we do not become more safe. Right? With more police funding, we do not become more safe. It's more funding in the right areas that our communities become more safe. So with that, I'm going to say, disband the police, disband capitalism. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Parry. And thank you to everyone who participated in the discussion. That was an excellent conversation. And I hope to see you all shortly at the closing rally at 4:45.
Yeah, you should be able to move yourself back into the main session, and if not, I can move you in, and if not, everything will get shut down and we'll all end up there regardless in a few minutes anyhow.